Hi, everybody. Good morning. I thought today we could talk about some of the causes and the effects of our revolution. Now, we all kind of know the effects because we're living under them, but the causes are a little different. In the first half, or I should say the 18th century, England passed the Navigation Acts. And the whole objective was to hold those on board ships to be English, majority English. Later, they tightened it up so it had to be 75% English. And when you get into the 1750s, they got involved in basically a world war. It's the 7-Year War. And in America, our part of that conflict was the French and Indian War. France was fighting on one side with some Indians, and the English were fighting on another side with another group of Indians. And it was basically a fight over a territorial dispute. In 1763, when the war had ended, England had gained control of Canada. But the war cost them a tremendous treasure. And as such, they had to recoup the money that they had spent on the war. And the colonies were actually just about the richest part of their vast control of land. So they first tried to tax us using the Sugar Act and the Molasses Act. But basically what happened was we just smuggled and got around them because they were more of a direct tax. So you had people like John Hancock, who was running the House of Hancock, which was an importing firm. And they were smuggling in. And there were lots of different importers that were smuggling in, and they were getting around the tax. So Britain decided to pass a Stamp Act. And so every document, every deed, every marriage certificate, all this stuff had to have, in order for it to be legal, it had to have a stamp on it, even on cards and dice, all kinds of different documents that had to be stamped. So that became more of an indirect tax. And this is what infuriated them because they really couldn't escape it. With the Sugar Act, they could just get somebody to go around it and smuggle it in. But you couldn't smuggle in an official document with a British stamp on it. It was a short-lived tax, but the Continentals, the colonists, were infuriated. So much so that there was a group that was formed called the Loyal Nine. Now, the Loyal Nine evolved, had a group of some printers, there was a painter, there was a newspaper, there was some newspaper man, jewelers, these kind of basically common business owners. And they were furious over this tax, and they dwarfed into the Sons of Liberty. Now, they did an awful lot of damage. They hung the stamp officer in effigy. They burned the governor's property, sacked his home, and threw books and other things into into the street and they lit it on fire. Benjamin Franklin, talked with Parliament and managed to get it repealed. But there were riots going on. People were angry. There was the Boston Massacre occurred. And basically, Samuel Adams had his hand on most of these things. He helped in organizational efforts. He was really instrumental in getting a revolution going, and he was determined to cause trouble. He was an instigator. And he got people into the streets. They used bells, they rang church bells to get people into the street, and that's basically how you had the Boston Massacre. There was a disruption, an argument over a product that hadn't been paid for by European military. See, what had happened, once you started having the riots happen, Britain from Quebec sent a regiment of troops down. They passed a British Quartering Act, and we had to house soldiers in our homes. And they weren't very popular, obviously, because you had somebody who had no business being in your home, And mostly in Boston, we were having this huge feud, and they closed the port of Boston. There was an item that wasn't paid for by the British soldier, as I mentioned earlier, and there was a crowd gathered, and they started getting into a fight. Well, the soldier backed up on the stoop and still holding the gun. Well, the bells were rung. The people came out around, and they were challenging the soldier to fire. Now, there were several of these soldiers there, but they were scared, and they did eventually shoot. 3 were killed instantly, and 2 died from their wounds later, and they were charged with murder. Samuel Adams convinced a couple of the other lawyers in the area to defend them, and they were released, found not guilty of murder based on self-defense. This really was a big improvement because it showed Britain that we were able to have a fair judiciary system. But getting back to the Stamp Act, they ended the Stamp Act, and they instituted the Townshend Acts. And there were a number of things that were taxed on the Townshend Acts, but they weren't quite as big a problem for the colonists. And John Dickinson started writing letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. And that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to get rid of the Townshend Acts. But even things like tea were taxed. And that's why they went in and masked themselves as Indians, wearing feathers and the whole bit, and went on board a ship at night, and they took hatchets, broke open cases of tea, and they threw them overboard. And this is what's known as the Boston Tea Party. So you had all this activity going on, and when you had, with the port of Boston blockaded, there was a real problem. There was starvation going on in Boston. The other colonies were shipping in goods. They were smuggling stuff in from up north and then bringing them down. They were giving colonists arms and ammunition and black powder being smuggled in. And what they were looking for when the shots over Lexington, when they went into Lexington and conquered, what they were looking for, or they were looking for three things. They were looking for John Hancock, they were looking for Samuel Adams because they had warrants for their arrest, and they were looking for all the ammunition stores. And when they marched out of Boston, is they controlled Boston. But what they didn't control is the countryside. So when they marched out of Boston into the countryside, Paul Revere, in his famous ride, warned that they were coming, rode his horse down, warned they were coming, found John Hancock, for instance, at the Monotony Tavern. And they were having a meeting with a couple of colonels there. They had to hide in the cornfield even as they passed. So the British marched out. Paul Revere warned them they were coming, and they all came out, the Minutemen, those, get ready, the state militias. They all came out and they met the soldiers on the Lexington Green. Shots were fired, and that was the beginning of our war. So that's kind of how things happen. That's the causes of the war. Of course, the effects wound up being that we can live in liberty and freedom because we beat them. We learned a lot of tactics from the Indians who we've been fighting for some time. It's not like we didn't have some experience at fighting, but we were no match for crack of British troops. So it became a very lengthy battle, very lengthy war. But as we progressed through the conflict, and they had Hessian troops over here, and there were different groups that they were hiring mercenaries to come over. But we were fighting on our own land. And just like many conflicts, when you're fighting on your own land, you're going to fight a lot harder. All you have to do through attrition is make it costly enough to them that they'll stop. So I just thought you'd like to know a little more about the causes and effects of the war, and I hope you got something from my talk. And I'll catch you next time on the next Constitutional Talk. Thank you. Have a good day.